In the autumn of 1889, in a fold of the Bitterroot country south of Hamilton in the Montana Territory, a young woman counted out $3 onto a clerk's pine counter and bought a dead man's shack, and the men along the wall laughed at her for it. The shack stood 4 miles up a wash that ran dry by August, and it had belonged to a road agent named Asa Crail, who had robbed the Corvallis stage line for 9 years and died in a county cell of a fever the winter before, leaving nothing behind that anyone had been able to find. They had searched it. The deputies had pulled the floor, and the law had read the walls, and a dozen hopeful men had crawled the roof, and they had taken away a broken chair and a rusted stove, and the verdict that the place was empty. The woman who bought it was 28 years old, and her name does not need saying twice, so it will be said once now and then mostly left alone. She was called Della Hart. She had come to that counter with everything she owned tied in a gray wool blanket and $3 in her glove, and she had heard the talk before she ever reached the door. A dead outlaw's shack for the price of a meal. The thing nobody wanted, sold to the woman nobody wanted, and the clerk wrote her name in the ledger with a small private smile, as if recording a joke he would tell later. What none of them knew was that Della had not bought the shack for shelter, though she needed shelter, and she had not bought it for the land, though the land was hers now too. She had bought it because of a thing her grandfather had taught her with his hands across 11 winters, and because of one sentence Asa Crail had said to a stranger in a saloon 2 years before he died, a sentence that had traveled, the way sentences do, until it reached the one person in the territory equipped to understand it. Stay close to this one. There is more here than a cold roof and a dead man's name, and the proving of it will take patience, and the patience will be hers. She had been cast out 3 weeks before the first hard frost. The household where she had kept books and mended and cooked for 2 years had no further use for a woman whose presence had become inconvenient to the master's wife, and so she had been paid her last wage short, given a reference that praised her work and warned against her character in the same breath, and put out the gate with the season turning. It had been a long brick house on the edge of a town to the south, with a wife who watched the way Della's competence drew the husband's respect and decided, the way some women decide, that the safest economy was to remove the source. There had been no scene. There rarely is in the casting out of a useful woman. There had been only a folded paper of coins pressed into her hand at the kitchen door, a few dollars short of what she was owed, and the cook looking elsewhere, and the gate latch falling behind her with a small final sound. She did not weep at the gate. She had learned a long time ago that weeping was a thing you did where it could do you some good, and there was no good in it on that road. Her grandfather had been a locksmith and a safe man in the honest trade, fitting strong boxes for banks and merchants from St. Louis westward for 40 years. And when his eyes failed, he had come to live with Della's family and had taught her the work because there was no one else who would sit still long enough to learn it. He taught her the feel of a lever falling. He taught her that a lock is not a wall but a conversation, and that the man who built it left his temper inside it for anyone patient enough to listen. He taught her that the best hiding place a clever man ever made was the one he was sure no one would think to question, and that such places announce themselves to the trained hand by being too ordinary, too finished, too plainly nothing at all. He had died when she was 19, and he had left her his tools, a roll of oiled canvas that held a set of picks and tension wrenches worn smooth as river stones, a small brass-cased lever gauge he had made himself, and a curved iron pry no longer than her forearm that he called the Persuader, with a handle darkened by his grip and hers. She carried them in the leather satchel at her hip the way another woman might carry bread. They were the only inheritance she had, and she had never once thought of selling them, not in the leanest winter, not on the worst road. Now you may wonder why a woman with such a skill had spent 2 years keeping another family's books instead of opening locks for pay. And the answer is the plain one. There was no trade in it for a woman. No bank would hire her. No merchant would trust her. And the one time she had offered her services in a town to the north, a man had laughed and asked what else her clever fingers could do. So she had folded the skill away and kept it private, and used it only on her own troubles, and waited without quite knowing what she waited for. She was waiting, it turned out, for a dead outlaw's shack and $3 and a sentence carried on the wind. The sentence had come to her by way of a freighter named Pell, an old man with a white beard stained yellow at the corner of his mouth, who hauled goods up the Bitterroot, and who had once shared a bottle with Asa Crail in the back of a Corvallis saloon. Pell had told the story for years without knowing it was a story, the way men tell the small strange things they have seen. Crail had been drunk and bitter and near the end of his nerve, and he had said, looking at nothing, that he had built himself a bank no lawman would ever break, and that he had built it with his own hands out of the one thing every fool overlooks. Then he had laughed and would say no more. Pell thought it was the talk of a drunk. Della, hearing it second-hand on a cold porch, thought it was a man telling the truth and trusting the truth to be safe because no one believed him. So she bought the shack. $3, the men laughed, for 4 walls and a roof a goat would refuse. The land office was a narrow room that smelled of tobacco and wet wool, and a dozen men stood along the wall waiting on business of their own, and they turn the way men turn when a woman walks into a place she is not expected, with a slow interest that was half boredom and half appraisal. The auctioneer was a heavy man named Doss with a watch chain across his belly, and when he read out the parcel, the Crail place, 4 miles up the Sleeping Child Wash, improvements such as they are. He said the words, improvements such as they are, with a wink that brought a laugh from the wall before the bidding even opened. There was no other bidder. There had never been going to be another bidder. Doss looked at the small sum she laid down and made a joke about her now owning the most famous empty box in the county, and a younger man near the stove, red-faced and pleased with himself, asked if she meant to keep house for the ghost, and asked it loud enough that she was meant to hear. She let them talk. Her grandfather had taught her that too. Let the doubt of small men be the privacy you work behind. A clever hand, he had said, does its best work where no one is watching, and the surest way to be unwatched is to be thought a fool. So when they laugh at you, thank them, for they have just looked away. She signed the ledger in a steady hand, while the clerk smiled his small private smile, and she took the deed and the iron key that fit a lock the deputies had already broken, and she asked Doss one question, level and quiet, which was whether anyone had ever found the wagon road up the wash or whether she would be walking it. Doss said there was no road worth the name, and laughed again, and she thanked him for that too, and walked the 4 miles up the dry wash with her blanket on her back and the satchel at her hip, and she did not look behind her once. The shack was worse than they had said, and better than she had feared. It sat against a low rock shoulder where the wash bent, a single room of squared logs chinked with clay, a sod and shake roof sagging at the ridge, a stone chimney, 1 shuttered window, and a plank door hanging from a single hinge where the law had forced it. The floor was dirt, hard-packed and swept, which she marked at once as strange. A man who lived in filth does not sweep a dirt floor. The deputies had dug it in 3 places and left the holes, and the holes were empty, and the emptiness of them was the first thing that told her she had been right to come. She spent the first 3 days not looking for anything. She cut a new hinge from the broken chair's iron brace, heating it in the stove and bending it over a flat stone with the persuader for a hammer. And she rehung the door so it swung true and latched. She daubed the worst gaps in the chinking with clay from the washbank, packing it in with her fingers and smoothing it flat, working until her hands were raw and gray to the wrist. She set the rusted stove level on flat stones and cleaned its flue with a switch of green willow and burned the dead man's last cord of wood, and slept on the floor in her blanket with the satchel under her head. She hauled water from a seep a quarter-mile up the wash in the one sound bucket the deputies had left. And while her hands did the small, honest work of making the place livable, her eyes did the other work, the patient inventory her grandfather had drilled into her, the slow reading of a room the way you read a stranger's face. What is too new here? What is too old? What has been touched 1,000 times and what has never been touched at all? She read the door, the window, the stove, the 4 walls. She read the swept dirt floor and the 3 empty holes the deputies had dug and abandoned. She found nothing the first day and nothing the second. And she did not let the nothing trouble her, because her grandfather had taught her that a careful man's hiding place is patient, and that patience must be met with patience, or not met at all. On the 4th day, she found the first thing wrong, and it was the chimney. The chimney was fieldstone, mortared rough, the kind any homesteader builds in a week, and it climbed the north wall plain and ugly and exactly as a chimney should. The firebox, though, was wrong. She had cleaned 100 fireplaces in her life of service, and she knew the proportion of a hearth the way she knew the proportion of a lock. And this firebox was shallow. The outer stack was deep enough for a good draw, but the inner box stopped a full 18 inches short of where the stone face promised, and the back wall of it was not soot-black stone, but a slab of dressed granite, smooth, fitted close, mortared at the edges with a mortar a shade paler than the rest. A man had built a false back into his own fireplace, and then burned fires against it for years to blacken the lie. She did not tear at it. That was the deputy's way, and it had found them nothing. She sat before the cold hearth with her grandfather's gauge in her hand, and she studied the seams until the light failed, and she understood that the slab was not mortared so much as wedged, fitted into a rebate cut in the surrounding stone, and held by its own weight and by 4 iron pegs. She could just make out where the pale mortar had cracked away. It was a door. It was a heavy, patient, beautifully ordinary door, and the man who built it had counted on every searcher being too impatient to see that the back of a fireplace could be a thing that opened. It took her 2 more days to open it, working an hour at dawn and an hour at dusk so the smoke of her cooking fire would not draw a curious eye up the wash. She freed the pegs one at a time with the persuader and a wooden mallet she carved from a knot of pine, easing rather than forcing, listening to the iron the way her grandfather had taught her to listen, until each peg gave up its grip without snapping. When the last peg was free, the slab still would not move, and she nearly believed she had been wrong, until she understood that it was not meant to pull outward, but to pivot, hung on a hidden iron pintle at one edge, balanced so a child could swing it once the pegs were drawn. She set her palm flat against the cold granite and pushed, and the false back of Asa Crail's fireplace turned on its pin with a low grinding sigh, and the breath of air that came out of the dark behind it was colder than the room and smelled of iron and old paper, and the particular dust of a place sealed against the world for a long time. Behind the slab was a cavity cut back into the living rock of the shoulder the shack leaned against, a space the size of a small wardrobe, and in it, set on a ledge of stone, stood an iron strongbox. She did not reach for it at once. She sat back on her heels in the firelight and let herself look, because her grandfather had taught her that the moment of finding is the moment a careless hand makes its worst mistake. and because some part of her, the part that had stood silent at a gate 3 weeks before, needed simply to see the thing that proved the laughing men wrong. The box was a good one. She knew the make at a glance, a Hall & Sons double-walled box out of Cincinnati, the kind a bank would bolt to its floor, and she knew without trying it that the deputies could not have opened it in a week, and that Asa Crail had not bought such a thing off a road agent's takings without a reason. She drew it out into the room. It was heavier than its size, the double wall packed with the hardening plaster the makers used against drills, and its face carried a single keyhole and a combination dial, both fouled with rust, but sound beneath. A lesser thief would have blown it. The scorch of powder would have ruined whatever it held. Asa Crail had not blown it, which meant Asa Crail had the combination. And a man who keeps a combination keeps it close. And the closest place a man keeps a thing is the place he has already chosen as his bank. Stay close to this one. The narrator will say it plainly. What Della Hart did next, she did across 9 days. And it was the finest work of her life, and almost no one ever saw it. She did not have the combination, but she had the box's own temper to read. She cleaned the dial seat with oil from her grandfather's roll and a feather, working the grit out of the brass collar grain by grain until the dial spun true and silent on its spindle. And she set the brass gauge against the dial's edge, and she began the long conversation. A combination lock, her grandfather had told her, is a row of wheels that want to tell you where they stop, and they tell you in the smallest catch and slip of the dial against your fingertip, a thing you cannot hear and cannot see but can feel if you have made your whole hand into an ear. She turned the dial through its 100 numbers a quarter turn at a time, feeling for the place where one wheel's notch dropped into the fence, and she wrote nothing down because writing was a thing that could be found, and she carried the growing pattern in her head the way she carried her grandfather's voice. The cold was the enemy more than the lock. The shack held no warmth past the reach of the stove, and her hands were the instrument the whole work depended on, and a cold hand is a deaf hand. So she learned the rhythm of it. She would warm her fingers against the iron of the stove until the feeling came back into them, then cross the room to the box and work until the feeling went, then warm them again. And the days shortened around her while she did it, the light through the one shutter going from gray to gold to gray again, and the wash outside silent but for the wind, and once, far off, the cough of a mountain cat. She ate little. She slept when her hands gave out, and not before. She kept the cooking fire small and burned it only at the hours the valley below would expect smoke from a chimney, so that no man looking up the wash would wonder why the dead outlaw's place burned a fire at midnight. The first wheel gave on the 3rd day. She felt the notch drop into the fence under the pad of her forefinger, a catch no larger than the tick of a watch, and she held her breath and turned back and found it again to be sure. And then she let herself smile once in the cold and went on. The 2nd wheel gave on the 5th. The 3rd fought her until the 8th, because rust had pitted its edge and the catch was false in 2 places, ghost notches that mimicked the true one, and would have sent a hasty hand turning the whole stack wrong. And twice she lost the count of where she was, and had to stop and press her cold hands flat against her own ribs and begin the entire row again from nothing, swallowing the despair that rose each time, because despair, her grandfather had said, is only impatience wearing a long face. On the 9th day, in the gray hour before dawn, with her hands so cold she had to warm them against her own body between turns, the 3rd wheel dropped at last, clean and certain, and the 4th followed it within the hour, as if it had only been waiting, and she felt the whole stack of them come into a line. A thing more felt than known, the lock holding its breath. She set the persuader aside. She put her hand on the iron handle. She turned it, and the bolt drew back with a sound like a single low word, and the door of Asa Crail's bank swung open in her cold hands. What lay inside was not gold, and she had not expected gold, because a man does not call something his bank for the coins in it. There were coins, a canvas sack of them, more money than Della had held in her life. But she set the sack aside almost without looking, because beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with waxed cord, was a packet of papers, and papers were the things she had come 4 miles up a dry wash to find. She untied the cord by the light of the open stove. The oilcloth had done its work. The papers were dry and whole, and the topmost was a letter in a careful hand, and the hand was Asa Crail's, written by its date, in the last autumn of his freedom, addressed to whoever was clever enough to be reading it. He had known he was caught before they caught him. He had written it down, because a man who has done wrong sometimes wants one true thing left standing after he is gone, and because the wrong he had spent 9 years robbing was not, it turned out, the wrong the territory thought it was. The narrator will go carefully here, because this is the heart of it. Asa Crail had robbed the Corvallis stage line, yes. 9 years of it. A strong box here, a mail sack there. Never a man killed, which the territory counted strange in a road agent, never troubled to ask why. He had not robbed it for himself. He had robbed it because the Corvallis line was owned, behind 2 layers of paper and a respectable name, by a man named Ostrander, who held the only bank in that stretch of the valley. And because Ostrander had built his bank the way some men build everything, on the slow legal theft of people too poor and too far from any court to stop him. Crail's letter laid it out in the plain bookkeeping of a man who had once kept books himself. Ostrander loaned against land at rates that could not be met, foreclosed in seasons he chose, and recorded the foreclosures with a territorial clerk he owned, and over 15 years he had taken the deeds to 19 homesteads from families who had cleared and broken and planted them, and had called it all lawful, because on the paper it was. Crail had been one of them. The first homestead Ostrander took, the letter said, had been Crail's father's, and the old man had died on the road west out of the valley, and Asa Crail had gone bad over it in the particular way a decent man goes bad when the law itself is the thief, and there is no law above it to appeal to. He could not rob Ostrander's bank, which was guarded and lawful, so he robbed Ostrander's stage line, year on year, and he did not keep the money, or not much of it, and the papers beneath the letter said where the rest had gone, and to whom, and against which debt. And that was the thing that made Della Hart sit very still on the cold floor for a long time. Beneath the letter were the deeds, not Ostrander's recorded foreclosures, but the original deeds, the true ones, 19 of them, the patents the families had held from the territorial land office before Ostrander's clerk had buried them under fresh paper. Crail had stolen them back. Across 9 years of robbing stages, he had also, patiently by bribe and theft, and the trust of clerks who pitied him, recovered the 19 original deeds and the loan records that showed the rates for the usury they were, and he had hidden them not because they were worth money, but because they were worth justice, and he had died before he could find a hand honest enough and clever enough to use them. There was a list in the letter of the 19 families with what had become of each, as far as Crail had been able to learn. Most were scattered. Some were dead. Against several names, though, he had written a place they had gone to ground, a town, a married daughter, a brother's farm, the small forwarding addresses of the dispossessed, and the last family on the list, written in a hand that had pressed harder on the pen, was a widow named Susanna Tilghman and her 2 children, who had lost their 40 acres along the burnt fork when the children were small, and who, the letter said, still lived in Corvallis itself, taking in washing, a half-day's walk from the land that had been taken from them, watching another man's cattle graze it. Della read the list twice. Then she wrapped the deeds again in the oilcloth, and she did not touch the sack of coins except to count it, which she did because numbers were a thing you owed the truth, and there was a little over $400 in it. And she wrote the figure in her head, beside the figure of her own $3, and let the size of the difference be what it was. She closed the strongbox. She swung the granite slab shut on its pin and set the 4 iron pegs back loosely, not to hide the cavity now, but because a thing built with that much care deserved not to be left gaping. And she walked the 4 miles back down the wash to Corvallis with the oilcloth packet inside her dress against her skin. And she went to find the washerwoman first, before any officer, before any clerk, because her grandfather had taught her that you carry a thing home before you carry it to court. Susanna Tilghman was a spare woman of perhaps 50, with red hands and a careful, guarded face, and she did not at first believe a word of it. She lived in a single rented room above a harness shop on the back street of Corvallis, reached by an outside stair, and the room smelled of lye and wet cotton, and lines of other people's washing crossed it from wall to wall, so that Della spoke to her through a forest of hanging linen. She had stopped believing in the return of taken things a long time before. She stood in the doorway with a basket of wet linen on her hip and listened to a stranger in a red shawl tell her that the 40 acres along the burnt fork were hers again, and her face did not move, because hope, to a woman who has lost as much as she had lost, is just another way to be robbed. Twice she started to close the door. Once she said, flat and tired, that she had no money to pay for whatever this was, because she had learned that a stranger with good news on the back stairs is most often a stranger with a handout. Della did not argue with her. She took out the oldest of the 19 deeds, the one with the Tilghman name on it, and the territorial seal still whole, the paper soft with age but the ink still black, and the seal unbroken. And she put it in the woman's red hands, and she said only that the man who hid it had wanted it to come home, and that there were lawful ways to make it stand, and that she would help if help was wanted. Susanna Tilghman looked at the paper for a long time. Her thumb found the raised seal and pressed it the way a person presses a thing to learn whether it is real. Then she set the basket of wet linen down on the floor, very carefully, as if it had become something that might break. And she pressed the back of one red hand against her mouth. And the narrator will leave her that small privacy and say only that what passed across her face was the thing Della Hart had walked 4 miles to put there. Susanna Tilghman looked at the paper for a long time. Then she set the basket of wet linen down on the floor, very carefully, as if it had become something that might break. And she pressed the back of one red hand against her mouth. And the narrator will leave her that small privacy and say only that what passed across her face was the thing Della Hart had walked 4 miles to put there. The rest of it took the better part of a year, and it took it the slow, lawful way, which is the only way that holds. Della did not march into Ostrander's bank and lay the deeds on his desk. She had been taught better than that. Taught that the man you confront is the man who finds a way to make you disappear. And that paper beats a man best when it reaches him, already filed and sealed and beyond his reach. She found, in the territorial seat at Missoula, a land office examiner named Coyle, a tired and honest functionary near the end of a long career, the one titled Man in This Story. And she laid the 19 original deeds before him with Crale's loan records and let the documents do the speaking that no accusation could. She did not tell him at first where they had come from. She told him only to read them and to set the recorded foreclosures beside the original patents and to tell her, as a man who had spent 40 years with land paper, what he saw. Coyle put on his spectacles and read for the better part of an afternoon, and the longer he read, the stiller he became. And at the end of it, he took the spectacles off and rubbed the marks they had left on his nose, and said very quietly that he saw a robbery, and that it was the lawful kind, which was the worst kind, and which he had given up ever expecting to see undone. Coyle was slow and careful, and frightened at first of what he held, because Ostrander was a name that had broken careers. The deeds, though, were genuine, sealed by an office Coyle himself had served under as a young man, and the loan records were in Ostrander's own clerk's hand, and the usury was plain, and the foreclosures laid over the true patents like a forgery laid over a master's signature. Coyle did what such men do when at last they are given cover to do right. He filed. He sent certified copies to the federal land office in Helena by a courier he trusted and not by the territorial mail. He opened a quiet review of 19 foreclosures, and he did it in writing, on the record, where Ostrander could not reach it without reaching into federal paper, which even Ostrander would not do. It was slow work, the slowest, a thing of affidavits and certified copies and clerks in distant offices. And through all of it, Della stayed up the wash and came down only when Coyle sent for her and asked for nothing, and let the paper do what paper does when at last it is pointed the right way. Ostrander understood that he was finished some weeks before anyone told him so. The narrator will enter his thoughts once, briefly, because the loop must close. He sat in his good office above his lawful bank, and he read a single letter from the Missoula land office requesting his records on the Tilghman foreclosure. And he understood from that one sheet of paper, the way Della had understood from one overheard sentence, that the ground had shifted under 15 years of careful theft, and that he would spend the rest of his life and most of his money in courtrooms watching it all come apart, undone not by a posse or a bullet, but by a box in a wall that he had never known existed. He was never confronted. He was never arrested in any scene worth the telling. He simply began that winter to lose, slowly and lawfully and completely. And within 3 years he had sold the bank and gone east, and become a thing the valley no longer spoke of, which is the only kind of ending the worst men ever really fear. The deeds came home one by one. Not all of them, because not all of the families could be found, and a deed without an heir is only paper. 11 of the 19 homesteads, even so, were restored across that year, and the next, the foreclosures voided, the records corrected, the families that remained brought back onto land that had been taken from them, and the 8 that could not be traced were held in trust by the land office against the chance of an heir, because Della had asked for that, and Coyle had agreed that it was right. She took nothing for herself from any of it. She gave the $400 from the strongbox to the court to be divided among the restored families against the back taxes the territory wanted, and she kept the $3 shack and the 4 miles of dry wash, which was hers, and which no one laughed at any longer. Susanna Tilghman got her 40 acres along the Burnt Fork in the spring of the 2nd year. Her son was grown by then and able to break the ground, and Della walked out to see it once, the day they set the first plow in, and stood at the edge of the field in her red shawl and watched the soil turn over dark and wet behind the blade. Susanna came and stood beside her and did not say much, because she was not a woman of many words, but she put one red hand on Della's arm and left it there a moment, and that was a whole speech. The men who had laughed in the land office came around the slow way that doubters do, which is to say they never quite said they had been wrong, but they stopped telling the joke, and then they began to tell a different story, the one where they had always thought there was something to that shack, and Della let them keep it, because she had learned long ago that a doubter's pride is a small price for a doubter's silence. and she did not need them to say it. The work had said it. It always does. She lived on in the territory, and she did at last find a use for her grandfather's trade, because Coyle, who had seen what her hands could do with a box no one else could open, sent her quiet word now and again of a strong box an estate could not unlock, a bank vault gone stubborn after a flood, a sealed safe in a foreclosed building whose owner had died with the combination in his head. And she went and she opened them, and she was paid honestly for it. The first woman in that stretch of the Bitterroot to make her living at the safe man's trade, and the last to be laughed at for it. Asa Crail's strong box she kept. She cleaned it and oiled it and set it in the corner of the one-room shack she never did leave, the place she had bought for $3 and the contempt of strangers, and she kept her grandfather's tools in it, the oiled roll of picks, the brass gauge, the curved iron persuader with its darkened handle. A bank no lawman would ever break, the dead man had called it. He had built it for justice and died before he could spend it. And a woman cast out before winter with $3 in her glove had walked up a dry wash and spent it for him, every last coin of it, on the only thing it had ever been meant to buy. She was an old woman before she told the whole of it to anyone, and when she did, she told it to a granddaughter of Susanna Tilghman's, a girl who farmed the burnt fork land and who had come up the wash one autumn to thank the woman her family spoke of in the low voice reserved for the nearly holy. Della was past 80 by then, her hands gone to knots, her eyes failing the way her grandfather's had failed, and she sat the girl down before the cold hearth with the false granite back still hung on its hidden pin, and she swung it open one last time to show how it was done, the slab turning under her ruined hands as easily as it had turned the first cold morning. Balanced still, patient still. The girl asked her, before she left, whether she had ever been afraid, up the wash alone all that first winter, opening a dead outlaw's bank with a dead man's tools. Della thought about it. She said that fear was a thing she had left at a gate a long time before, and that what she had felt up the wash was not fear, but the opposite of it, the quiet that comes when a pair of hands finds at last the exact work they were made for. Then she sent the girl home down the wash before dark, and she sat alone in the firelight with her grandfather's roll of tools across her knees, and she ran her thumb along the worn handle of the iron persuader, the one thing in all of it that had been hers from the start, and the fire settled in the grate, and the cold came down the chimney past the granite slab, and she was where she had always meant to be. If you have ever been counted as nothing by people too comfortable to look closely, you may know already what she felt with her thumb on that worn iron, and you might say so, in a quiet word, to whoever told you the story. And if a tale of a dismissed woman and the thing the world threw away is the kind you want to sit with, there are others like it waiting. The shack still stands, they say, up the dry wash south of Hamilton, the door rehung straight, the chimney plain and ugly and hiding nothing now, and inside in the corner an outlaw's iron box that holds a locksmith's tools and a story about what patience does to a lie given enough cold mornings and an honest pair of hands.